Hi, everyone. It's great to have you with us again today. Jill and Louisa and I are talking about emotional agility. It's a topic that's come up time and time again, even in these last few weeks. So Louisa, why don't you talk to us a little bit about the topic, and then we can jump in as well.
Okay, sounds great. Yeah, I was thinking this was a super important topic. I actually think it's even more important now than maybe it ever has been in terms of our ability to navigate sort of our emotions that are happening now. I did a session this morning with a team and I asked them to articulate all of the feelings that they've been feeling over the last few weeks. And they came out with a laundry list of things from happiness and joy and love and relief all the way to worry, concern, frustrated, challenged. So it's really running the gamut. And of course that happens in everyday life all the time. But for me, it feels like it's under a microscope, like it's even more diverse in our feelings and more quickly are we moving from one end to the other. And so how do you manage that? How do you try to stay in a more positive place, get some perspective, stay rooted to your values? And that's why the conversation around emotional agility came up. So I want to share with you guys the model so that you can see what it is that I'm talking about. You can see this in lots of different ways. This may be a way that you haven't seen it before, but basically, when somebody is having an emotional reaction and conflating their thoughts and their actions together, it's what Susan David calls getting hooked. So she's written a book, Emotional Agility, and she really introduced this topic of when we get hooked into a pattern of behavior where we are doing something based on our thoughts without really getting the proper perspective or understanding whether it's really true, whether we have all the information. And so I don't know about you guys, but I find this a really useful way to think about all the different steps. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that when I first looked at the book and Emotional Agility, Susan David, is from South Africa, and it all started when she was 15 and she lost her father. And she, as she sort of coins in the book, she said, I became really good at just being okay and sort of suppressing her emotions and suppressing her feelings. And, we've talked a lot about relating this to the Pixar movie of Inside Out, if anybody's ever seen that movie, where the characters experience all of these different emotions that you just described, Louisa, which is joy and sadness and anger and grief. And instead of suppressing those feelings, we can learn a lot, as Susan David says, from just acknowledging them. And sort of when we get hooked or triggered by a certain emotion and it shows up for us, how do we then understand what that means? And I think that one of the best kind of little sentences from that book for me was, emotions are data, not direction. And so how do we look at the data instead of letting it drive us in a certain direction?
Yeah, so that's the showing up piece, right? When we sort of acknowledge those emotions and we're willing to not try to make them something that they're not, try to wash them away, say, oh, we shouldn't feel that way. But instead acknowledge it. And then what she calls stepping out is where we kind of create some space between the understanding of the emotion and labeling it, and then what we choose to do. And so I think that's a really great way to remember to kind of get up on the balcony or get some perspective and make sure that we're understanding what actions we're taking and having them tied to our values.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. You guys know I try to meditate every morning, and I use Headspace, which is an app for at least one of the ways that I meditate. And the gentleman that does it talks about noting something. Oh, I feel frustrated, or I feel stressed, or I feel angry. Note what that is. It's almost like putting what's the bubble above your head. And I find that that's helpful for me when I'm, fill in the blank. I'm feeling X, whatever that X is. And if I can change my focus a little bit or try to ask the why, and, giving that perspective, then I can sometimes change my feelings. And I feel that, okay, I've changed my focus, I've changed my feelings. What does that look like? And it makes me think of this client that I worked with who was getting a new manager and came up with this whole, it was hooked and showing up in this certain way, and it was all of these things. And I said, well, what if that wasn't accurate? What if the data you're telling yourself isn't true or isn't going to show up in that way? And it took her a while to that deliberate effort to step back and say, okay, if that is not true, what could that be? And it was very helpful and powerful to her because she had this whole story, the bubble over her head, that didn't end up being accurate, but we can convince ourselves that it is.
Yeah. And so the walking your why is where you basically, you create that space and you all of a sudden say, maybe I don't have all the information. Well, now what are my values? Like, what's important to me, and how can I make a choice on how to react to the situation that's attached to my values, so that I am walking my why. I am being courageous in going the path that I want to go to be true to who I am. And so, you know, in these situations where we're maybe feeling, you know, I find myself getting frustrated with the kids, and my reaction is to kind of snap at them or speak sharply. And what I realize is that the emotion I'm feeling is that I'm a little overwhelmed trying to manage home and work and everything all together. But that's not really the way I want to show up to them. And so creating that little bit of space where I can make a different choice to maybe speak to them in a different way, or recognize what it is that's making me irritated and try to eliminate it or change it somehow, makes me feel better about the situation. It allows me to move on and then, of course, be thriving. So that's really this model, and why I think it's a great one to think about now, is creating that space between our thoughts and our actions, and make sure that we're making a conscious choice about sticking with what our values are.
Yeah, I love that. I love that there's another part when I think about what's the walking your why is. When Viktor Frankl wrote about this concept in Man's Search for Meaning, he talks about what's the stimulus and then the response. And in the middle of that stimulus response is this choice point. And so what's the choice we can make? Your example is great, Louisa. I have the same questions myself when I'm competing with work and children and schedules, and think my daughter's set up for the Zoom meeting, and then of course, you know, she's not. And so I think that how we can relate this to our values, and how we can also be curious about what the value is and how we can move on, and attaching that emotion to the value, so that we've got curiosity around this.
Well, and it's interesting because when you look at this model and you think, wow, this is a whole step-by-step process, and how am I going to get from hook to being able to thrive? And it seems so huge. Yet really, small perception changes can ultimately lead to huge impact for you by doing something just a little bit. I took a year-long positive psychology program, and part with Whole Being Institute and Tal Ben-Shahar, who's sort of a thought leader around happiness. And he wrote a book called Choose the Life You Want. And really this whole idea of every choice, every situation is you have a choice. You have a path, you have another option. Sometimes we feel like we don't, especially in the situations we're in right now, but we do have that choice. And it is a small thing that can make a huge impact on what you do and how you do it.
For sure. Those small adjustments.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So there was a story with one client who felt undermined in a meeting, that every suggestion he was putting forward was never really taken on. And so instead of staying hooked in that feeling, he decided to sort of be brave and have a difficult conversation. And, you know, we went through a model of asking open questions and using some I statements to say to the person that was running the meeting, when this happens, I feel this way. And it ended up being a really powerful conversation. And I think that instead of staying hooked and just imagining that this was always going to be the static state, he was able to move through it. And so by using a few, whether it's open questions or a difficult conversation, practicing that, and actually taking some ownership can help us to move forward in those emotions when we do get hooked.
So did he end up recognizing that the emotion he was feeling was something different than he originally thought? Like, did it alter his perception of that emotion?
No, that's a good question. No, he felt that the emotion was real, and that, you know, he felt frustrated, and he felt that he wasn't being listened to, and that his suggestions weren't being taken on. And that was not how the other person was perceiving it. So it allowed him to sort of just think of it slightly differently. And to take ownership also, when we think about how do we get to that state of thriving, sometimes we can take some action and sometimes we don't. Sometimes we can just accept that emotion, find a friend, journal or meditate, or find other ways internally So there's the internal, but then there's also an action step as well that we could take to which feels most appropriate in the moment.
I love the story of the study that was done about the white bear, and about how the people were asked to not think about a white bear, but as it turned out, they couldn't, because as soon as you said white bear, the white bear was in their head. And Susan David, this is a metaphor for the fact that when an emotion happens, when we try to suppress it or make it not show up, it actually can get bigger, and it sort of lays there and simmers. And so that act of acknowledging it and recognizing it and labeling it and saying, I'm feeling frustrated or I'm feeling upset, actually allows you to move beyond it. That sometimes when you're trying to, right now, I shouldn't be frustrated about this work. I should be grateful I have a job. That kind of thing where you try to suppress that frustration in order to replace it with something else isn't always effective. Acknowledging it and moving on from it is more effective.
Well, there's an analogy that I've seen, a little cartoon where it shows, here comes that, bubble or balloon over your head with the thought. And you're like, oh, there it is. Yep. Put the needle in it or pin in it. It goes away. And then you can think more clearly. And oh, here comes another one. Yep. Put another needle or, pin in it. And it allows us to really recognize it's there, but yet do something about it.
Yeah.
And how many times have all of us said to our clients, what's your gut telling you? Or what's your gut making you feel? And we try to put it down, don't pay attention to it, but it's right there next to us or in our laps all the time.
Yeah. I have to say, Carol, when you were talking about Headspace, I really like Headspace, the app as well. And I have a really hard time meditating. I just can't sit still. So I found on Headspace that they have a walking meditation, and it's a walking meditation in nature. And I listened to that recently, and it was amazing, because I was walking through the park with the dog, and I had this walking meditation on Headspace, which really worked for me. So it just, shows whatever you can use or adapt can work really well.
That's wonderful. I didn't know that. That's great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you guys so much today for coming and talking with me about emotional agility and giving me some more ideas to take back to my clients. And I hope that all of you that are listening have gotten something out of today's session. And there's some further resources that will be coming up on your screen when we're done. So thank you. Have a great day.